Good morning. It's Reverend Mike Capron from the First Presbyterian Church of Troy. We are in the third part of a three-part series on some of the prophets around the Babylonian exile. This happened in 587 BCE. And I'm going to try and summarize this whole sermon series in a short span of time and get on with part three. Here we go. Part one was warning. The prophet Jeremiah brought warning. You will be imprisoned. You in that sentence and in this sermon is almost always plural. You all will be imprisoned. I'm using the metaphor of imprisonment for this summary. Resistance to warnings take the form of denial. No, I won't. You are crazy. Things aren't that bad. Denial represents our vain attempts to believe that everything will stay the same. We engage in denial when we like the status quo and don't want it to change. Denial keeps us from reality. It prevents us from entering the new world which is arriving. The only thing that lets us enter the new world is grief. We grieve the old world that we loved. That grief allows us to see the new world as it really is and begin to make the changes we need to make to live in it. Part two, metaphor, we're in the prison. Like it or not, here we are, looking at the world through the bars on our windows and doors. Ezekiel speaks to our new reality. He gives some practical advice. Be tough and submissive. Don't just be tough, that will get you killed. Don't just be submissive, you will lose yourself. Do both. Be tough and submissive in appropriate measure, and remember God, God's holiness. Only holiness brings hope of a better future. Only holiness lets us see past our nostalgia for the old world and our fears about the new one. It gives us a third place to stand, looking the present squarely in the eye. Today we're focusing on part three. We've been in the prison long enough that it seems normal. We don't notice the bars anymore. We've been co-opted into our oppressor's culture. Walter Brueggemann likes to use the word empire here. He would say that we have accepted the values of the surrounding empire. I can't think of a better word for our jailers, so I'm going to use his word in this sermon. The temptation we face in empire is amnesia. We've forgotten that we have another home. We've forgotten that we have, or used to have, some different values. It is to this situation that the second part of the book of Isaiah speaks. The prophet brings words about getting out of prison, leaving exile, returning home. The interesting thing about this message of homecoming is that it only works if you remember that you are in exile. And if you have amnesia, you may not remember that. So part of 2nd Isaiah's purpose is to prompt that memory, that realization. Now, before I continue, let's talk a little more about some of the metaphors used in this series: exile, captivity, imprisonment. We are using them in relation to an actual historical event, the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonian Empire in 587 BC. But that historical event has been used as a metaphor countless times since then. The book of Revelation cloaks its criticism of the Roman Empire under references to ancient Babylon. Martin Luther talked about the true church suffering under the Babylonian captivity of the 16th century Catholic hierarchy. The Pilgrims on the Mayflower thought of themselves in a sort of Babylonian captivity where they could not worship correctly and freely in Europe, so they journeyed to the new land. African American spirituals used this imagery to describe their lives under slavery. German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer described the church under Nazism as living in exile. All these examples discuss what happens to groups or countries or racial ethnic communities. You may find that this applies also to your individual life. People feel imprisoned by poverty or addiction or debt or bad relationships. But if that is your situation and these sermons help you, terrific. But my primary orientation is to talk about groups, especially our national life together and our common life as a church. So now back to part three and 2nd Isaiah. I had never thought about this before, this idea that homecoming only makes sense if you know you're in exile. If that doesn't happen, the reason is probably that you have come to think of your place of exile as your home. So, what is all this talk about going home? People who have been mentally and spiritually captured think their prison is their home. And by the time of second Isaiah, 2 generations have been born in Babylon. They remember nothing of Jerusalem other than in the stories their parents and grandparents told them about the old country. So it's hard when you're used to things to imagine something different. This is one of the challenges we face in the church today. Nationally, a huge number of teenagers may graduate from high school without ever having set foot in a traditional church building like ours in Troy. What we find inspiring and strengthening, full of beautiful memories, may seem strange and even scary to them. Our natural human tendency is to take the easiest path, to stay with what is known and familiar. Even if the familiar is a form of exile, we do not know we are in exile, so talk of returning to God seems like nonsense. Not that we church people are immune from this danger ourselves. Perhaps we too suffer from amnesia. But nostalgia is a great danger for us as well. Nostalgia gets in the way of seeing the truth about our situation and seeing what new things God may want to reveal to us. Or perhaps nostalgia is just a form of amnesia. It takes our thoughts away from the present reality and wastes our capacity in vain imaginings of an idealized time that never was. So we church people need to be careful. Every one of us who realizes we are about to say something like, we should just go back to the way things were, or we've never done it that way before, should clamp our hand over our mouths and count to 10. Stop and wonder what an alternative imagination would look like for the subject at hand. I guess the truth is that even if you go back to the old world, it's not the same. Read the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah for when God's people really do go to Jerusalem. The city's a ruin, the temple is gone, and not even the defensive walls stand. There's a lot of rebuilding to do, and it will never truly be the same. So what are we to do, we exiles? The most important work we can do in the church is to articulate an alternative imagination that remembers who God is and what God has done. Articulate an alternative imagination that remembers who God is and what God has done. Why is it an alternative imagination? Because it refuses to accept, endorse, or proliferate any of the narratives of exile. Walter Brueggemann wrote, "Empire, Babylonian or any other, wants to establish itself as absolute, wants the present arrangement to appear eternal in the past as in the future, so that after a while one cannot remember when it was different from this, which means that our imaginations have no real alternative." Again, empire is a generic term. It can stand for government, culture, factions, affinity groups, political parties, cults, anything that wants to comprehensively rule our imagination. In this sermon series, we've spent a lot of time thinking about ancient Israel. This week, I decided to think a little about modern Israel. I Googled for Israeli and Palestinians group working for peace together, and was pleasantly surprised to find that there are dozens of them. I'll list a few. Valley of Peace Initiative, Alliance for Middle East Peace, Comedy for Peace, Middle East Justice and Development Initiatives, the Parents Circle Families Forum, made up of Israeli and Palestinian families who've lost members due to conflict, and Combatants for Peace, which is made up of living veterans of that conflict. I watched a video about that last group and posted it to our church Facebook page last week. Well worth the 10 minutes viewing. I was very moved by what I saw. It seems to me that all these groups refuse to believe the dominant view from within the Israeli administration and from Hamas that one side or the other must completely win. Both of these alternatives are what Brueggemann would call imperial, and neither one is realistic. A lot of people on both sides have done a lot of horrible things to one another. The dominant narratives would have the world believe that there is no alternative to total victory, total destruction of their enemies, too much water under the bridge, too much blood. But an alternative imagination is rooted in memory and also imagines new possibilities. So these groups working for peace are articulating an alternative imagination that a third way is possible, one that doesn't look like a return to the era before the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, or one that looks like modern Israel minus all the Palestinians. It's a godly imagination rather than a human one. It considers a new and better world rather than a nostalgic return to an old one which may never really have existed. It is, as Brueggemann puts it, a homecoming to a new home. Enough about the Middle East. What about us? How do we act in these days? In part one of this sermon series, I listed several areas of our national and religious life which have substantially changed. I suggested that none of them were going back to what they once were. What would an alternative imagination that remembers who God is and what God has done, what would that look like for us as Americans and church people in 2025? On the political front, it was not realistic to think we will go back to the way politics were practiced in 2012 in the post-World War II order. There is much that was good about that kind of politics. Many of us in this room will miss those years and that style. We need to grieve this loss because only grief permits newness. What would an alternative imagination look like in the new political world that is unfolding? As God's people, we should not completely buy into the narratives of either political party. Republicans are clearly ascendant at the moment, and Republicans who are feeling exultant about that and long for still more power should reread 1st and 2nd Kings and its warnings about the temptations of power and how kings are not always great. If the only thing Democrats can imagine and work for is to shove the political pendulum equally far back in the other direction, they too have failed to articulate a godly alternative imagination. As I prayerfully consider these matters, I find that I have no desire for either political party to completely suppress their opponents and reign supreme through any combination of hard and soft power. If one believes that we are all human beings beloved of God and fellow citizens together, such outcomes are horrible to contemplate. The only way to wish for such an outcome is to mentally dehumanize half the population of the country, to stop thinking of them as human beings at all and as fellow citizens, and subsequently oppress them. As disciples of Jesus, that should be unthinkable for us. There must be another way. We must prayerfully seek an alternative imagination which allows us to transcend the options given to us by the imperial narratives of our bipolar political scene. How about the church front? The numbers for mainline churches like ours are depressing. I joked about my desire to go back in time and experience what it was like to be a pastor in the 1950s when new members flowed through the doors. But I need to be careful of nostalgia. The church of that era was not perfect either. Many Christians were co-opted into the Cold War mentality and the paranoia of McCarthyism and the Red Scare. Far too many churches of that era overlooked the injustice of segregation and the larger picture of racial discrimination, as well as undervaluing the gifts of women. Yes, it's good and important work to review these prophets. The cycles they describe are a persistent part of the human condition. God always sends prophetic figures to warn us about the path we're on, to urge us to change course. Sometimes we ignore the warnings and fail to change course, and suddenly our old world ends, and we are captured by another not of our making. We are exiled to a place we did not want to be in. Then the grief must come. It prepares us for newness. And God sends other prophets to help us find a way to survive our captivity. They tell us how to be tough and submissive. They remind us that the human powers who seem to rule over us have no real power, not in comparison to the Lord of hosts, the Holy One. Later, other prophets come. Many of us have forgotten our imprisonment, exile, and captivity have come to seem normal to us. But these prophetic figures bring the memory of what God has done in the past. As an example, listen to Isaiah 51:12-16. The Lord says, I am he who comforts you. Why then are you afraid of a mere mortal who must die, a human being who fades like grass? You have forgotten the Lord, your Maker, who stretched out the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth. You fear continually all day long because of the fury of the oppressor who is bent on destruction. But where is the fury of the oppressor? The oppressed shall speedily be released. They shall not die and go down to the pit, nor shall they lack bread. For I am the Lord your God, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. I have put my words in your mouth and hidden you in the shadow of my hand, stretching out the heavens and laying the foundations of the earth, and saying to Zion, you are my people. That's good news, my friends. We are God's people. And the words are important, for they inspire us to alternative imagination. They remind us that there is another home for us. There are some songs in biblical passages about how this world is not our true home. In our worship service, we're going to sing one. What's true and good about them is that they remind us of our captivity to things of this world, and they remind us that the way things are at the moment are not final, permanent, or eternal. How those songs are misused is when someone uses them to tell us that what happens in this world doesn't matter, that we should just focus on heaven and leave this world to the politicians and influencers and polluters. I pray that we'll all take the first best meaning and avoid the second. For God cares about this world and all the people in it, and so should we. I urge you to do it with an alternative imagination that is grounded in the love of God for us, our reciprocal love for God, and the love that God has for our neighbors, and the ways we obey the commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves. May God bless you all, my friends.